In this lecture, let's try to set up a resource server which exposes some REST APIs in a secured manner so that only authenticated and authorized users can invoke them to get details about accounts, transactions, loans and cards, etc. We can also discuss how establish a link between resource server and KeyCloak server so that my resource server can interact with the KeyCloak server to check the validity of an access token provided by client applications. So as you can see here, I have created a Maven project with the name resource server. First, I will check what kind of dependencies that we have inside pom.xml. So don't worry, whatever source code that we are going to discuss inside this lecture, I am going to upload to this video so that you can download and explore it based upon your convenience. So as you can see here, my pom.xml, the very first dependency that I have is Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. And the very next important dependency that I want to highlight is, since my application has to act only as a resource server, I have to add a dependency Spring Boot Starter OAuth2 resource server. So this indicates to my Spring and Spring Boot application that this is an resource server which is trying to leverage OAuth2 framework. And next, we have other dependencies like Spring Boot Starter Web, Spring Boot DevTools. So Spring Boot DevTools is a dependency which will help me in reflecting my code changes without restarting the server manually. So internally, my Spring Boot DevTools, whenever I make a change, it will detect what change I have done and it will deploy only that change instead of deploying the entire application. So with the help of Spring Boot DevTools, your restarts and deployments will be super fast. So this is just an advantage to this project, but without this dependency also your project should work. But in order to reflect your changes, you should be doing manual restarts and deployments. And the next dependency that I have added is internal H2 database. So in this project, I don't want to use a dedicated SQL database. Instead, I want to use internal H2 database to store my data. So this is one of the way also that you can do inside Spring Boot applications whenever you're doing POC, since we already done previously by storing the data into a dedicated cloud database like MySQL database. So here I want to show you a different approach. So that's why here I'm adding an H2 database to store all our details internally without the need of maintaining a database separately. And at last, we have a Spring Boot starter test which is used for unit testing. So once all these dependencies are added, you can go and open the main Spring Boot application with the name resource server application. You can see there is nothing fancy. You know about Spring Boot application. We also did the similar annotations for projects that we developed in the previous sections, like component scan will scan all the controllers configurations during startup, and enable JPA repositories will enable all the repositories that we have inside our project so that we can interact to a database and fetch the data. And entity scan we use to scan the entities or models associated to a database table that we have inside our project. So once this is done, if you go and observe, we have a config class where we maintain project security config. I'll come to that package and class. Apart from that, everything is very similar to what we have discussed or developed previously. So there are individual controllers like account controller, balance controller, cards, loans, contact, notices. So these controllers exposes the APIs inside them. And there are model classes like accounts, cards, which supports these APIs. And similarly, we have a JPA repository like accounts repository, cards repository. So there is nothing new that I have built here. It's just that I have cleaned all Spring Security Framework related code. Like inside this project, you don't see any authentication provider or password encoders or any database interaction to validate my user credentials like load user by name. So all those methods I'm not using anywhere. I will just rely on my KeyCloak server to do authentication and authorization. So before I show you what is present inside project security config, let me show you accounts controller, which is one of the sample implementation. You can see here there is an API my account which is exposed by accounts controller. What it will do is it will take the email details that I have sent in the request. Based upon the email, it will load all the accounts present in the database and give to the user. But in order to invoke this API, someone has to pass authentication and authorization. So how do we enforce that security is with the help of Spring Security configurations inside the class project security config. As you know, we have to extend web security config adapter, and whenever you extend this class, we have to override the method configure where we can mention our custom requirements on how we want to protect our resources inside a resource server. First two lines I'll come to that, but before that, first I'm doing a course configuration, but this course configuration is more for the UI application that is exposed by Angular app. And next, I'm saying every request has to be authorized, and especially if the API is matching my account, the individual or the client application should have a role of user. And similarly, I made for my balance, it has to be admin. And for loans, there is no restriction around roles and authorities, but the user or client application has to be authenticated. So that way, I also mentioned for my cards that the user can be user or admin role. And for /user also, it has to be authenticated. Whereas for notices and contact APIs, there is no need of any authentication. Those are permitted to everyone, and anyone can invoke without authentication and authorization performed. Post the ANT matches, I'm saying I don't want any CSRF checks to happen. I want everything related to CSRF is disabled, because whenever you incorporate OAuth2 framework inside your application, you are already following enough industry standards, then there is no need of following extra layer of CSRF token. So that's why I'm disabling it. But if you want to follow, how to enable it and how to generate a CSRF token based upon our previous sections discussions. And at last, the important configuration that I want to mention is, in all the sections that we discussed previously, we used to configure form login or HTTP basic login. But here, since I want my project should act as a resource server, I need to mention .OAuth2 server, and I'm telling it has to follow JWT token standard. And since KeyCloak server maintains all the roles details inside JWT token, I just wrote a custom JWT authentication converter to convert all the roles present inside my token and pass on to the Spring Security framework. So how that happens is, if you go and look at the KeyCloak role converter, which implements a converter, here I'm just taking the JWT access token that I received from the KeyCloak server. Inside that JSON object, I look for an key value object with the key realm access. Inside the realm access object, I will have roles defined for a specific user or client application. So I'm trying to get those roles and append role_role name for them here. This is because my Spring Security framework will expect a role prefix to be appended for all my roles like admin and user. So due to that reason, I'm doing that custom logic inside this converter. And as you can see here, has any role will only expect the role name without the role_. It will expect the user or admin. So internally, it will append the role_, and it will try to compare whether the given role of an user is matching with what configured. So what I'm trying to say here is, my Spring Security framework will append role_, to this role name, and it will try to compare what we are getting inside the access token from the KeyCloak server. And since we did that kind of custom conversion like role_role name, it will matches and your authentication and authorization will happen successfully. So once you make these configurations inside your project security config, now your project will act as an resource server that incorporate OAuth2 framework. And one more change that we have to do is to establish a link between your resource server and KeyCloak server so that it can validate the access token received every time in order to give a proper response to the client applications. So in order to establish that link, you don't have to do many changes inside your application. You just have to go to application.properties and mention a property name which is spring.security.oauth.jwt.jwk-set-URI. So here you just have to give your KeyCloak endpoint URL, localhost 8080 and auth followed by reals, and this is the real name that you might have created. So if you go and check our KeyCloak server, so this is the real that we have, EazyBank dev, the same value I have mentioned, protocol OpenID connect /certs. So this endpoint URL is almost static except the value real name which is EazyBank dev. So whenever you want your resource server to connect a different real name, then you have to change the real name here. So with this single configuration, my resource server know how to connect to my authorization server to validate the access token received from the client application. And all these configurations that you see at the top of the file these are internal H2 database configurations. I'm telling what is the database URL. Since I'm using the H2 internal memory database, I just have to use these values like you can see here. What is the driver class name, and by default the internal H2 database username is SA, password is blank, followed by I have to give configurations related to what is the dialect that my JPA has to use, which is H2 dialect. And if needed, we can also have an web console enabled for our internal memory database that I'm enabling. And server.port I'm mentioning here as 8081. The reason is already the default port which is 8080 is taken by the KeyCloak server. So this resource server has to run in a different port. Due to that reason I have mentioned server.port. And remaining two configurations is just to show your SQL statements inside your logs and consoles. So once we make all these configurations related to internal H2 database, we should be good and we can go ahead and start our resource application. So let me try to start my resource application by clicking debug as Java application. So now my resource server started successfully at the port 8081. So let's try to validate whether our configuration is working properly or not by trying to invoke one of the security API without passing any credentials. So I came to the Postman. I'm trying to invoke the API my account by passing the email value of the user, and if I click send, you can see I'm getting 401 unauthorized user. So which means my resource server setup is successful and it is protecting the APIs based upon the configurations that we have done. And since I have not passed any authorization details, so my API is giving an error 401. And I forgot to highlight about the data.sql present inside resource server. As you know, since we are using internal H2 database, so every time we restart this resource server, we have to make sure the data and the tables are setting up properly. So all those table details and data details that you want to create whenever a server is restarted, you have to mention inside data.sql present inside the resources folder. So the name of the file should be data.sql only. So make sure you're following the same naming convention. So here you can see I'm first dropping any tables exist. Post that I'm creating all the tables and inserting the data for those tables. So this way I set up my resource server successfully. I'm making sure that data tables also created inside my internal H2 database. I also tested by invoking my account API without passing any credentials or without passing any authentication and authorization details, and I got 401 error. So in the next lecture, let's try to explore on how to get an access token from the KeyCloak server and pass to resource server so that I'll get a proper response from it. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye.